They had been told American food came with a price, the interpreter said quietly, but no one translated what that price was supposed to be, and so the women stood in silence, 30 of them in a loose line beneath a pale southern sky that felt too wide, too open, too untouched by war, their gray uniforms hanging light against their frames as if even the fabric had grown tired, and in front of them, on a wooden table that looked borrowed from a farmhouse kitchen, lay something wrapped in thin white paper, still warm, still breathing faint threads of steam into the humid air. Private Daniel Carter stood behind the table with his sleeves rolled just past his elbows, a gesture born more from heat than intention, his movements practiced, almost mechanical, as he placed each wrapped portion down with equal distance between them, not looking at the faces across from him, not really seeing them. Because seeing required something he had long ago learned to set aside, and yet the silence pressed indifferently today, heavier, like the pause before a storm that never quite arrives. Anna Weiss stood third from the left, though no one had assigned positions and no one would have noticed if she moved, her posture straight but not rigid, her hands resting loosely at her sides, fingers still, eyes not on the food but on the man distributing it, not with accusation, not even with curiosity, but with a kind of quiet measurement, as if she were trying to understand something that could not be explained in words. The paper in front of her shifted slightly as a breeze passed through the yard, carrying with it the smell of something unfamiliar, something rich, something that did not belong to ration lines or field kitchens or the memory of scarcity. It was a smell that spoke of fullness, of excess even, and that alone made it suspicious. No one moved, not at first. The line held, breath slowed. Time stretched thin across the space between offering and acceptance. Daniel reached for the last portion, placed it down, and stepped back half a pace, a distance small enough to be unnoticed, but deliberate enough to matter. He wiped his hands on a cloth, folded it once, then again, each motion precise, contained, controlled, the kind of control that comes from repetition, from routine, from doing the same thing long enough that it no longer requires thought. But even as he lowered his hands, he felt it, that pause, that absence of motion where there should have been something else, hunger, maybe, or relief, or even suspicion strong enough to break the stillness, but instead there was only waiting. Anna did not look at the food, she did not reach for it, she did not speak. Her gaze remained steady, not confrontational, not pleading, simply present, and for reasons he could not explain, Daniel found himself aware of it, aware of her in a way that broke through the practiced distance he carried between himself and everything else in this place. The paper crinkled again as the breeze shifted. Somewhere beyond the fence a truck engine turned over, then faded. The world continued, but here, in this narrow strip of ground between two sides that had been taught not to understand each other, nothing moved, nothing changed, and for a brief moment that stretched longer than it should have, it felt as though the entire war had narrowed itself into this single exchange, not of food, not yet, but of something quieter, something unspoken, something that waited to be decided not by orders or rules, but by what someone chose to do next. One of the women shifted her weight, a small movement, barely noticeable, but enough to ripple through the line like a quiet signal. The paper in her hands crinkled as she picked it up, not quickly, not with hunger, but with the careful hesitation of someone who had learned that nothing given freely during wartime ever truly was. She held it for a moment without opening it, feeling the warmth through the thin layer, as if trying to understand it before committing to it, and then she glanced sideways, not at the guards, not at the fence, but at Anna, because even without words there was something about her stillness that suggested direction. Anna did not nod, did not speak, but her eyes lowered for the first time, not to the food, but to the woman's hands, and that was enough. The paper unfolded slowly, the sound soft but distinct in the silence, revealing something simple, a long bun, pale and soft, holding a sausage that glistened faintly under the sunlight, a thin line of mustard drawn across it in a way that seemed almost careless, almost human. The smell grew stronger now, warm bread, cooked meat, something sharp and unfamiliar. The woman hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around the edges, then she looked up, just for a second. And Daniel saw it, not fear exactly, not even distrust, but calculation. The kind that comes from surviving too many uncertain exchanges. He reached down without thinking, picked up one of the remaining portions, and unwrapped it himself, the paper tearing cleanly. He held it there for a moment, as if presenting evidence, then took a bite, not exaggerated, not performative, just a single, ordinary bite, chewing slowly, swallowing, and then he set it back down on the table without saying a word. The gesture simple, almost dismissive, but it landed differently in the air, like something had shifted just enough to be felt but not yet understood. The woman watched him, then looked again at what she held, and this time, when she brought it closer, her hands did not shake. She took a small bite, cautious, measured, as if testing not just the food but the moment itself. Her expression did not change at first, her face remained still, controlled, but something in her shoulders softened, just slightly. As she chewed, slowly, deliberately, and then swallowed, the silence held, waiting, and then she took another bite, a little larger this time, and the shift became visible, not dramatic, not emotional, but real, like a door opening just enough to let light through. Around her, others began to move, one by one, paper unfolding, hands lifting, each movement tentative at first, then steadier, the line no longer frozen but not yet relaxed. Somewhere near the end, a younger woman hesitated longer than the rest, her grip tightening as if she might put it back down, and that was when Anna moved, not forward, not toward the table, but sideways, a single step that brought her closer to the younger woman. She did not look at her, did not speak, she simply reached out and adjusted the way the paper was held, turning it slightly so the food would not slip, a small, practical gesture, nothing more, and yet it carried something else, something quieter, something that did not need explanation. The younger woman looked at her, just for a second, then nodded almost imperceptibly and took her first bite. Daniel watched this, not the eating, not the reactions, but that moment. That small correction of hands, that silent instruction, and for the first time since he had stepped behind that table, he was no longer thinking about procedure or distribution or routine. He was watching something else entirely, something that had nothing to do with food and everything to do with choice, and he stood there, unmoving, as the lines slowly transformed from stillness into something that resembled trust, not fully formed, not yet secure, but present, fragile and unmistakable all the same. The sound changed first, not the volume, not the number of voices, but the quality of it. The sharp stillness that had filled the yard softened into something textured, paper folding, footsteps shifting against packed dirt, the quiet rhythm of chewing, slow and deliberate, as if each bite required attention. Anna held hers for a moment longer than the others, the warmth fading slightly through the paper, her fingers steady, her posture unchanged. She did not rush, did not follow the movement around her. Instead, she looked once more toward the table, toward the man who had stepped back and now stood with his hands at his sides, not giving orders, not correcting, simply present. And then she lowered her gaze to the food, unwrapped it with careful precision, folding the paper in half instead of tearing it, placing it in her palm as if even the wrapper deserved not to be wasted. The smell reached her more clearly now. Not overwhelming, just unfamiliar in its fullness. She brought it closer, paused, not from fear, but from consideration, as if deciding what this moment meant before allowing it to happen. Then she took a bite, small, controlled, her expression unchanged as she chewed, but her eyes shifted slightly, not widening, not reacting outwardly, just focusing, as though something inside her was recalibrating. The taste was not the point, not entirely. It was the fact that nothing happened, no trick, no consequence, no hidden cost revealed itself, only warmth, only substance, only something given and taken without negotiation. And that absence of consequence carried more weight than any flavor could. She swallowed, took a second bite, no hesitation now, just movement. Efficient, composed. Around her the others followed their own rhythms. Some faster, some slower. One woman closed her eyes briefly as she chewed, not in pleasure, but in recognition, as if remembering something from a time before scarcity had defined every decision. Daniel watched Anna without realizing he had focused on her specifically. Something about the way she moved, the lack of urgency, the refusal to let hunger dictate the pace, it unsettled him in a way he could not name. Because it did not match the image he had carried, the idea of prisoners, of desperation, of need overriding everything else. Instead he saw restraint, choice, something closer to discipline than dependence, and it made him aware of himself, of the way he stood, the way he had eaten without thought, as demonstration, as proof, but without consideration. She finished half of it, then stopped, not because she was full, not because it was not enough, but because she turned, just slightly, toward the younger woman beside her, the one whose hands had trembled earlier, and, without a word, without ceremony, she adjusted the paper again, this time breaking the remaining portion cleanly, offering part of it without extending her arm fully, leaving the distance small but meaningful. The younger woman hesitated, then accepted, their hands not quite touching, just close enough to acknowledge the exchange. Daniel felt something shift again, not in them, but in himself. A quiet recognition that this was not about food distribution or compliance or routine, it was about something he had not expected to witness, something that did not require instruction or oversight, something that existed entirely outside of the structure he represented, and he remained where he was, not stepping forward, not stepping back, allowing the moment to continue without interruption, because for the first time since arriving at this place, he understood that not every action needed to be directed, some only needed to be seen. The last of the movement settled into something steady, not quite calm, not quite routine, but no longer uncertain. The line had dissolved without anyone giving permission for it to do so, small clusters forming instead, women standing closer than before, not out of necessity, but out of quiet recognition, the food no longer an object of suspicion but not yet something taken for granted. Anna finished the portion she had kept, her movements unchanged from the first bite to the last, deliberate, measured, as if each action still carried weight. She folded the remaining paper again, tighter this time, pressing the crease with her thumb before slipping it into the pocket of her uniform, not because it had value, but because nothing here was treated as disposable, not even something that had already served its purpose. Daniel noticed that, the way she kept the wrapper, the way none of the others dropped theirs to the ground. The yard remained clean without instruction, without enforcement. And it struck him as something unexpected, something that did not align with the assumptions he had carried into this place. He shifted his stance slightly, the gravel beneath his boots making a faint sound that drew a few glances, but not the kind that had filled the space earlier. These were different, softer, less guarded, not trust, not yet, but something closer to acknowledgement. He cleared his throat, not to command, but because silence now felt different, less necessary. "That is all for today," he said, his voice even, not raised, not authoritative, just present. The words hung briefly, then settled, and the women began to move, not in formation, not in rigid lines, but in a slow, natural drift toward the barracks, steps unhurried, conversation still absent, but no longer withheld out of fear. Anna remained where she was for a moment longer, watching the others go, her gaze not following any one person, but taking in the whole of it, the space, the table, the man still standing behind it. She turned then, not abruptly, just enough to face him directly for the first time, and for a second, nothing happened, no words, no gestures, just two people standing within a distance defined not by rules, but by choice. Daniel did not move, did not look away, and in that brief, unmarked exchange, something passed between them, not agreement, not understanding, but recognition. The kind that does not require language. Anna gave the smallest nod, so slight it could have been missed if he had not been looking for something, anything, that broke from expectation. Then she turned and walked toward the barracks, her steps steady, her posture unchanged, blending back into the group without drawing attention. Daniel exhaled slowly, a breath he had not realized he had been holding, and looked down at the table, at the empty spaces where the food had been, at the single portion he had taken a bite from earlier, still resting where he had set it down. He reached for it, paused, then instead folded the paper back over it, covering it as it had been before, his hands slower now, more deliberate, as if the action required more care than it had minutes ago. He stepped away from the table, not with the sharp turn of routine, but with a measured pace, glancing once more toward the barracks where the women had disappeared inside, the yard now quiet again. But not the same quiet as before. This one held something else, something left behind. Something that did not belong to procedure or protocol, and as he walked toward the far end of the yard, he understood, without needing to name it, that nothing significant had happened by the standards he had been taught to measure things. No reports would be filed, no orders changed, and yet, something had shifted, small, almost invisible, but enough that he would carry it with him, whether he intended to or not. The barracks held the heat longer than the yard, the air inside thicker, carrying the faint mix of fabric, dust, and something new that had followed them in without permission, the smell of bread and cooked meat lingering just enough to be noticed, just enough to feel out of place. The women settled into their spaces without speaking, movements quiet, practiced, each returning to a bunk or a corner as if guided by habit rather than instruction. Anna sat on the edge of her bunk, her hands resting loosely in her lap, the folded paper still in her pocket. She did not remove it, did not look at it again, as if its presence alone was enough. Across from her, the younger woman who had hesitated earlier sat with her back against the wall, knees drawn slightly inward, her hands now still, no longer gripping anything, just resting, as if they had finally been given permission to stop holding on. Time moved differently here, slower, not because there was less to do, but because there was less to guard against. One of the older women glanced toward Anna, not directly, just enough to register her presence, then looked away, but the glance itself carried meaning. A quiet acknowledgement of something that had shifted outside, something that had followed them in. Anna remained still, her posture unchanged, but her breathing had settled into a rhythm that was no longer dictated by caution. Outside, Daniel walked along the perimeter of the yard, his steps measured, not hurried, the late afternoon sun stretching shadows across the ground in long, thin lines. He passed the now empty table, paused for a moment, then continued. As if stopping there too long would require him to explain something he did not yet understand, he reached the far fence, rested his hand briefly against the wooden post, the surface warm from hours of sunlight, and looked out beyond it, fields stretching in quiet contrast to the contained space behind him. Nothing out there had changed, the world continued as it always had, steady, indifferent, and yet he found himself thinking not about what lay beyond the fence, but about what had happened within it, not the distribution, not the process, but the moment when nothing had been demanded and something had still been given. Back inside, a small movement broke the stillness. The younger woman shifted, then spoke, her voice low, hesitant, not loud enough to carry beyond the immediate space, but enough to exist. "It was not poisoned," she said. The words simple, almost unnecessary, but they landed with quiet weight. No one responded immediately, not because they disagreed, but because the statement itself was not about the food. Anna lifted her gaze slightly, not toward the speaker, but toward the window, where a thin line of light cut across the wooden floor, dust particles moving slowly through it, visible only because of the light, and she said, just as quietly, "No." Her voice even calm. "It was not." And then she fell silent again, but the silence was no longer the same as before. It was not built on fear or restraint, but on something more stable, something that did not need to be filled. Daniel turned from the fence and began walking back, the gravel shifting under his boots in a steady rhythm, each step grounding him in a place that now felt slightly unfamiliar, not because it had changed, but because his understanding of it had. He passed the barracks without looking directly at the windows, but he was aware of them, aware of the space inside, of the people within it, not as a group, not as a category, but as individuals who had made choices he had not expected. And as he reached the end of the yard, he slowed, just slightly, his pace adjusting without conscious thought, as if the day had left something behind that required a different way of moving through it, something quieter, something that could not be ordered or controlled. Only noticed, only carried forward in the spaces where nothing appeared to happen, but everything had already begun to change. Evening came without announcement, the light outside thinning into long shadows that stretched across the yard and slipped quietly through the narrow windows of the barracks, turning dust into something visible, something suspended. Anna remained seated where she had been, though time had passed, though others had shifted, lay down, or leaned into conversation that came in low murmurs. She had not moved much, not because she was frozen, but because stillness now felt different, less like restraint and more like choice. Her fingers brushed lightly against the folded paper in her pocket, not pulling it out, just confirming it was there, as if the object itself carried a memory she was not ready to examine directly. Across the room, the younger woman had begun speaking again, quietly, her words hesitant at first, describing the taste, not in detail, but in comparison, trying to place it against something familiar that no longer existed. The others listened without interruption, not correcting, not adding, simply allowing the words to settle as they were. Outside, Daniel sat on the wooden steps near the supply shed, his elbows resting on his knees, his hands loosely clasped, the posture informal, unguarded, something he would not have allowed earlier in the day. The sounds of the camp had softened, fewer movements, fewer voices, the kind of quiet that came not from command, but from exhaustion settling into the edges of the day. He looked down at his hands for a moment, then out toward the barracks, not focusing on any one window. Just aware of the structure as a whole, of the people inside it, and the thought returned, not as a question, but as a presence, that moment, the one he had witnessed without understanding, the one that had not required him to act. Inside, Anna finally reached into her pocket, slowly, deliberately, retrieving the folded paper. She opened it with the same care she had used before, smoothing the crease with her thumb, the paper now cool, empty, but still holding the faint imprint of what it had once contained. She studied it for a second, not searching for anything specific, just observing. Then she folded it again, smaller this time, more precise, and placed it on the narrow wooden ledge beside her bunk, not hidden, not displayed, simply set down, a quiet decision made visible. The younger woman noticed, her gaze shifting briefly to the paper, then back to Anna. No words exchanged, but something understood. Daniel stood after a while, not because he had decided to, but because sitting any longer felt like delaying something he did not yet know how to face. He walked back across the yard, slower than before, his steps measured, each one carrying the weight of a realization that had not fully formed. As he passed the barracks, he glanced once, just once, toward the window, and for a brief second, he saw her, not clearly, not in detail, just the outline of a figure sitting still, composed, present, and then he looked away, continuing on. But the image remained, not as a memory, but as something active, something that continued to shape the way he understood what had happened, what had not happened, what had been given without being asked for. Inside, Anna lay back on the bunk, her eyes open, fixed on the wooden ceiling above, the faint sound of evening settling around her, and for the first time in a long while, her thoughts were not occupied with anticipation of what might come next, but with recognition of what had already occurred. Not dramatic, not loud, but undeniable. Something small had shifted, not in the world, not in the war, but in the space between two people who had been taught to remain separate. And as the light faded further, leaving the room in soft shadow, she closed her eyes. Not to escape, but to rest within that shift, knowing it would remain, whether spoken of or not. Morning arrived quietly, not with sound but with light, a pale gray that slipped through the windows before the sun had fully risen, settling across the wooden floor in soft, uneven lines. The barracks stirred slowly, not all at once, but in small movements, a shift of weight, the creak of a bunk, the quiet exhale of someone waking without urgency. Anna opened her eyes before the others, not abruptly, not startled, just aware. As if she had never fully left the space she occupied, her gaze moved to the ledge beside her, to the folded paper resting where she had placed it, unchanged, undisturbed. She sat up, her movements measured, and reached for it, unfolding it once more, the creases now more defined, the paper thinner where it had been handled. She held it between her fingers for a moment, then folded it again, this time along a different line, smaller, more compact, before slipping it back into her pocket. Not as something to keep, but as something not yet finished. Across the room, the younger woman stirred, sitting up with a slow inhale, her eyes adjusting to the light. She glanced toward Anna briefly, then toward the others, as if confirming that the world had remained consistent overnight, that nothing had been taken back. Outside, Daniel was already in the yard, earlier than the day before, his posture different, not rigid, not fully relaxed, but aware. He moved with purpose, though the purpose itself was not entirely clear. The table had been set again, the same wooden surface, the The same arrangement, the same paper-wrapped portions placed with even spacing. But his movements lacked the mechanical precision of the previous day. There was a pause between each placement, a moment where his hand lingered just slightly longer than necessary, as if acknowledging the act rather than simply completing it. He stepped back when he was finished, but not as far as before, the distance between him and the table reduced by a foot, perhaps less, a difference small enough to go unnoticed by most, but not by him. The door to the barracks opened, and the women began to step out, one by one, not in formation, not waiting for instruction, but moving in a quiet sequence that suggested agreement rather than order. Anna was among the first, her posture unchanged, her pace steady. She took her place near the front, not asserting position, simply arriving where she arrived. The others followed, forming a loose line that was less defined than the day before, more fluid, as if the need for strict alignment had diminished. Daniel watched them approach, not scanning, not assessing, just observing, and when they stopped, when the space between the two groups settled into place, he did not speak immediately. The silence returned, but it was not the same silence as before. It did not press, did not demand resolution, it simply existed. Anna stepped forward first, not dramatically, not breaking any rule, just one step, enough to close a small portion of the distance. She reached for the nearest portion, her hand steady, her movement unhesitant. And for the first time, there was no pause before she began to unwrap it. The paper opened cleanly, the motion familiar now, practiced. She held it for a brief moment, then took a bite, calm, composed, not looking up, not waiting for confirmation, just acting. Around her, the others followed, not because she had led them, but because something had already been established, something that no longer required demonstration. Daniel watched this, not with surprise, but with a kind of quiet recognition, as if the moment he had witnessed the day before had not ended, but had continued into this one, reshaping it without announcement. He moved slightly closer to the table, not enough to intrude, just enough to stand within the same space rather than outside of it, and as he did, he understood, not in words, not in a clear thought, but in the way his body adjusted, that the distance between them had changed, not removed, not erased, but altered in a way that could not be reversed by simply stepping back. The rhythm of the morning settled faster this time, not because the routine had changed, but because hesitation no longer held it back. The paper unwrapped in softer, quicker motions, the quiet sounds of eating blending into something almost natural, almost ordinary, yet still marked by awareness, by intention. Anna stood where she had been, neither forward nor behind, her presence steady, her movements unchanged in their precision. She ate without looking up at first, her focus contained within the small space of her hands, but the absence of tension was noticeable now, not as relief, but as control reclaimed. Daniel remained near the table, closer than before, his position no longer defined by separation, his hands resting loosely at his sides, not occupied, not directing, simply present, and as he watched, he began to notice the details he had missed before. The way each woman held the paper differently, the way some folded it immediately, others left it open, the way no one rushed. Even now, even with familiarity, there was still a kind of respect in the way the food was handled, as if it represented something beyond itself. Anna finished her portion at the same measured pace, then paused, her gaze lifting slightly, not searching, not questioning, but observing the space around her. Her eyes passed over the others, over the table, and then, briefly, they met his, not long enough to linger. Not intense, just a moment of alignment, and in that moment, Daniel did not look away, not out of defiance, not out of intent, but because there was no reason to. The instinct to avoid, to separate, had loosened without his permission. She lowered her gaze again, but the exchange remained, not as a memory, but as something acknowledged. One of the older women stepped closer to the table after finishing, her movements slow, deliberate. She placed the folded paper back on the edge of the wood, not dropping it, not discarding it, just setting it there, and then stepped back. No words spoken, no gesture added. Daniel noticed this, the placement, the intention behind it, and without thinking, he reached forward and adjusted the small stack of papers, aligning them neatly, his fingers moving with care that had not been present the day before. The act simple, almost insignificant, yet it carried a different weight now. As if he understood that what was left behind mattered just as much as what had been given, the line began to dissolve. Again, not abruptly, but naturally, small movements outward, steps taken without instruction. Anna remained a moment longer, her hand brushing lightly against her pocket where the folded paper rested, confirming its place. Then she turned, her steps steady as she moved away from the table. But before she reached the others, she stopped, just briefly, and looked back, not at the food, not at the yard, but at him. The distance between them unchanged in space, but altered in meaning, and though no words were exchanged, the pause itself carried clarity, not gratitude, not acknowledgement in any formal sense, but something quieter, something that existed without needing to be named. Daniel stood still as she turned away again, rejoining the others without drawing attention, and as the yard returned to its quiet, as the last movements settled into stillness, he understood something with a certainty that did not require explanation, that what had begun as an act of routine had become something else entirely, something that could not be undone by returning to the way things had been, because the difference now was not in the food, not in the process, but in the space between people who had chosen, without instruction, to see each other differently, even if only for a moment, even if only within the boundaries of this place. The yard did not return to what it had been, not fully, even as the movements ended and the table stood empty once more. Something remained in the space, something that could not be cleared away with routine or replaced by the next day's repetition. Daniel stayed where he was longer than necessary, his hands no longer adjusting anything, no longer occupied by tasks that once defined his role. He looked at the surface of the table, at the faint marks left behind by folded paper, by careful hands, by choices made without instruction, and for the first time, he understood that what had happened here would not appear in any report, would not be measured or recorded, yet it carried a weight that no written account could hold. He stepped back slowly, not retreating, just shifting his place within the space, as if acknowledging that it no longer belonged solely to the structure he represented. Across the yard, the door to the barracks remained slightly open, not wide, not inviting, but not closed either, a small difference that might have gone unnoticed before. Anna stood just inside that doorway, not hidden, not fully outside, her posture unchanged, her presence quiet. She had not left with the others immediately, not out of hesitation, but as if there was something unfinished in the moment. Her hand rested lightly against the frame, fingers relaxed, not gripping. She looked out toward the yard, toward the table, toward him, not directly at first, but with the same steady awareness she had carried from the beginning. Daniel noticed her then, not as part of a group, not as a figure among many, but as a single point within the space, and the distance between them, though unchanged in feet and inches, felt different, less defined by separation, more by understanding that neither of them had asked for. She stepped forward, just one step, enough to stand in the doorway fully, the light catching the edge of her uniform, outlining her without drawing attention. She did not speak, did not gesture, she simply stood, and in that stillness something settled, not resolved, not concluded, but recognized. Daniel did not move closer, did not break the space between them, but he did not turn away either, and that, in itself, was a change. The moment held, not stretched, not forced, just present, until Anna reached into her pocket, slowly, deliberately, and removed the folded paper, the same one she had carried, the same one she had chosen not to discard. She looked at it briefly, then walked forward, her steps measured, crossing the yard. Without urgency, stopping just short of the table, she placed the paper down on the wood, not in a stack, not aligned with the others, but slightly apart, as if marking it, not claiming it, just leaving it where it could be seen. Then she stepped back, not waiting, not watching for a response. She turned and returned to the doorway, her movement uninterrupted, her posture unchanged. Daniel remained where he was, his gaze shifting to the paper she had left behind, different only because he knew where it had come from. He stepped forward then, closing the distance to the table, his hand reaching out, not to remove it, not to adjust it, but to rest lightly against the surface beside it, as if acknowledging its place without altering it. And in that quiet, unremarkable moment, he understood something that had no need for words. That dignity had not been given here, it had been carried, protected, and shown without demand, And all he had done, all he could do, was stand still long enough to see it. In a quiet prisoner of war camp far from the front lines, a German woman prisoner and an American soldier stand on opposite sides of a simple exchange that slowly reshapes everything they believed about each other. What begins as hesitation over unfamiliar food unfolds into a powerful moment of human recognition, where dignity is neither given nor taken but quietly revealed through action, restraint, and choice. This story captures the subtle transformation that defines the most compelling WWII stories, where the smallest gestures carry the greatest weight and silence speaks louder than conflict, as the German woman prisoner maintains her composure and moral clarity, and the American soldier begins to see beyond uniform and role. A fragile understanding forms without a single word needing to explain it. The presence of a simple meal becomes more than sustenance, turning into a symbol of trust, perception, and the breaking of deeply rooted assumptions, making this one of those unforgettable WWII stories that focus not on battle, but on the unseen shifts within people. Through careful observation, quiet actions, and shared space, both individuals move from distance to awareness, illustrating how WWII stories often reveal that humanity persists even in the most structured environments. The narrative follows their evolving awareness, showing how respect emerges not through authority but through recognition, and how a single moment can ripple into lasting change. Without dramatics or forced emotion, this story reflects the essence of authentic WWII stories, grounded in realism, restraint, and emotional truth, as the German woman prisoner and the American soldier continue their silent exchange. What remains is not resolution, but something more enduring, a shift in perspective that neither of them can undo. This is the power of WWII stories that center on dignity, where no words are needed, and yet everything is understood. Character 1, a white German woman prisoner in her mid-20s, slender build, pale skin, simple worn gray World War II uniform, minimal details, calm expression, steady eyes, front-facing portrait, natural lighting, realistic texture, cinematic realism, no CGI, no illustration, no cartoon, serious tone.